Good morning, Jane. So nice
Good
to have
morning.
you with us today. And you're going to give us a wonderful lesson on the basics of China painting. So everyone is excited for you to begin and teach us away.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining in today. We're going to go through a lot of information. So um, if you don't get everything written down, you can always go back and listen to the video on the iPad website. So we're going to start out talking about the basics of China painting. And I'm going to start with the mediums. There are basically four different types of mediums. There's a drying medium, and that has to have something in it that causes your paints to set up. So it either has to be Papeba or fat oil or turpentine, a drying aspect on that. And that medium will, you'll be able to paint on it for a while, but it will set up within an hour or two, and you're not going to be able to paint any more on that. If you're using a fat oil, you can paint, once it's dry, you can paint over it, but the others, they're going to loosen up if you start to paint over it. Then we have a semi-dry medium, which is what I use, and basically it's pretty much the same as your drying medium, except you have more of an open medium in it. Now I use the two parts lavender, 2 parts clove, and 8 parts Capeba, and it's the dark Capeba, and 2 parts mineral oil. The mineral oil keeps my medium open so that I can work with it all day and perhaps a little bit on the next morning. Your open medium is open all the time, and there's a lot of good open mediums out there to use. I found that when you switch from open to semi-drying, you're going to get more color on your piece, and it's going to force you not to play in your paints. And then last is a water-based medium, and basically you can use sugar water for that. It just is an adjuvant to hold your paint to your porcelain. So I'm going to show you here on the tile a water-based medium. There's a lot of different ones out there that you can use. The thing about the water-based medium is that you have to have a clean tile that doesn't have any oil on it. You have to use a palette knife that doesn't have any oil on it, and a brush that doesn't have any oil. And you're going to mix this just like you would your regular medium. However, I like to make it a little thinner because it dries very, very quickly. When you're using a water-based medium, you're going to have to use a synthetic brush because a natural hair brush will not work as well. And the good thing about the water-based medium is that it dries very quickly and you can paint over it. And it doesn't have any oil in it, so it doesn't collect a lot of lint. The bad things are it shows every brush stroke you make. And I don't like to paint with this because it sometimes if you get it too heavy, it will chip. But if you need something when you're painting that will dry very quickly, this is what you want to use. So I'm going to show you a little bit here about using the water base. And when I explain to you that it will dry very quickly, I'm going to show you how that happens. And then you can paint over it with your regular paint. Whoops, can't do that. Just stuck it in my oil. So with the water-based medium, you mix your medium with your paint, but then it's thinned with water. So if I want to thin this, I have to get into the water and thin it. That's why it's called a water base. And I can paint on here. You can see that it's showing all my brush strokes. And that's the bad thing about the water-based medium. And it dries very quickly. You're never going to get a smooth stroke with that because it shows all your bristles on your brush. So we're going to set this down for a minute, and then you can see it's going to dry, and then I can paint over it. So the one thing also about the water-based medium, it will become very hard, and you don't have to cover your paints because it doesn't collect any dust, and you can reconstitute it with water whenever you need it. So I like to use, in my medium, I like to use the dark Capeba, and I want to show you the difference in the dark Capeba, and this is the dark Capeba. When I mix this up with lavender and clove, it becomes very dark. And you can see it's very smooth in your fingers. It glides very smoothly. Now this is the regular Capeba that you can get. And I want you to notice the different, that's the regular Capeba. And as you can see, it's very sticky. And that will not flow as smoothly. Do you see how sticky that is? The reason we like the dark Capeba is because it's thinner and it flows so much nicer. However, it's very expensive and it's hard to find that dark Capeba. So I suggest that you look around and find what medium works best for your style of painting. And if you're a person who paints once every week or two, you're not going to want a drying medium. If you do, you're going to get everything painted because it will set up on you and you're not going to be able to move it. So if you are a person who likes to do portraits, you're also probably not going to use a drying medium. So as you can see on this paint, it's setting up pretty good. Normally it'll dry faster than that. So the other the part of the important things about China painting is your paints. And there are a lot of different paints. You can decide. I suggest that you find a set of paints that works best for you. We all have favorite colors, so stick with your favorite colors. And I have set up my palette so that you can see that it's arranged just like the color wheel. I'm going from my yellows and I'm going all the way down my yellows. And then I go to my greens and then my blues and my pinks. And I arrange them this way so that I can mix these as I'm painting. So the difference in the paints are you have your cadmium colors, which is any color that basically is pretty and bright. If you see it in your jar or on your palette, that's Christmas red or Santa red or carnation yellow, any of those colors like that is going to be very cannibalistic, which basically means it's going to eat everything you put next to it and on top of it. And if you put that on your palette and you get into it, when you pull that out of the kiln, it's going to be totally white and it's not going to hold color from that point on. So I usually don't deal with any of the cadmium colors. And then you have your iron colors, which are all your reds, and your cobalt colors are your blues and greens. And then the gold colors, of course, are your purples and rubies. So when I mix my paints, I want to mix them in the consistency of about toothpaste. So I start out and start mixing, and I usually mix up a whole vial because I don't like to mix paints, and I keep them in small containers. But you can mix paints with pretty much any medium. However, the more mineral oil you use, the less color you're going to get on your palette. So what happens is that mineral oil, when it fires, it boils, and when it boils, all that color burns away. So try to use as little as you can. The formula I use for mixing is the same as my medium, which is 8 parts Capeba, only I switch the Capeba to the mineral oil. So it's 8 parts mineral oil, 2 parts lavender, 2 parts clove, and 2 parts Capeba. Now, if you want it to be more open, then add a little more mineral oil or clove oil or lavender. And that'll keep it open longer. But the more mineral oil you put in it, the less color you're going to get. And you want to keep your paints pretty supple. The other part of mixing your paints is I turn them over every morning, because if you'll go and you'll look at your palette, the oil will begin to separate from the pigment. And when it starts to separate, it pulls it, the oil rises to the top, and the paint, because it's the heaviest, will sink to the bottom. Therefore, you have all your good color at the bottom of your pile of paint. So every morning I turn my paint upside down to reconstitute that paint and get it back on the top. Okay, this is about the consistency you want your paints to be, not real loose. And remember that the oil or the blues will have a tendency, if you put them in a pot, they will get more liquefied. So you're going to want to mix them a little thicker than the other colors. And even when I put it in the pot, they'll start to get thick. And so I reconstitute it out of that. So there's our medium value green. Okay. So mixing your paints. The old paints, if you have old paints from a state or your family, those paints are going to have a lot of what is it they took out of our paint? Anyway, that's what it's still in it. Anyway, they're going to take a lot more mixing. Today's paints have been ground a lot, so you're not going to have to use a grinding glass, but the old paints, you definitely want to get into a grinding glass because they're not as refined. The other part of our painting is our brushes. And when I first started painting, I used a ferrule brush, which is a brush that has been pinched together with metal. And these brushes are very stiff, and that's why they're easy to control, because they're stiffer and you get sharper cuts. I switched to a quill brush, which has been tied, and I like the long hairs because it drags like this. And it turns, and it's very floppy, and they're very hard to learn to control, but once you learn them, you may like it. So play around with your brushes and see what you like best. The other part I want to show you on your brushes is loading your brushes. And if you don't, what I find mostly in teaching is that most painters do not have enough oil in their brushes. Because I use a Capeba base medium, I don't have to worry about runs. If you are using a medium that is very open, you may want to watch how much oil you get in your paint. But if your piece is oily, just stick it in your oven before you put it in the kiln at 250 or 350 for about 20 minutes and let it cool off, and that'll burn all that oil off. Then you can put it in your kiln, it won't run. So loading your brush, the brush is meant to hold lots of oil, and it has this little pocket between the hairs and the stick. That pocket is meant to hold all the oil. So when you get into this, you're going to work it back and forth and turn your brush over. If you don't, you're just putting oil on one side of your brush and keep working it in there. And I do this quite often. I don't clean my brushes. I know a lot of your teachers are going to not like that, but I spend a lot of time putting that oil in there. And if I clean my brush after every use, I'm stripping all that oil out. And I want to keep that in there. So what I do is I'll go into my brush cleaner and just kind of pull the paint out of the hair and then come back. So your brush should have a shine to it. If it doesn't have a shine, you're not getting enough oil in it. And you want to have that shine up. You want to be able to see that. So I want to show you the difference of using a brush that doesn't have oil in it and one that has been conditioned. So this is a brush that I just very lightly dipped into the medium, and I'm going to load my brush here. And the stroke you're going to get is very light. Y'all see that? There we go. And shows every brush stroke. Now, if I come in here and condition this brush and get more medium in it, see how much more oil I'm getting into that. Then I wipe it off a little bit, the excess, go back in and load my brush. Notice the difference in the stroke. See the difference in the paint? You get 3 or 4 times as much paint on it by doing that. The other part I have found that most people do not load their brush with paint. So if you don't get enough oil in there to begin with, you're not going to get paint on your piece. And if you don't get enough paint on your brush, it's not going to come off on the china. So I come into and I'm working this paint back and forth. I'm loading both sides of my brush. If I don't load both sides of my brush, all I'm getting is paint on one side, and I can't get a lot of strokes out of that. So I'm working that paint back and forth and working it clear up in there. Now, when I hold this up to the light, you should be able to see the paint that's on there. Not a heavy chunk, but nice coat of color. And now I can get a nice smooth stroke by doing that. All right, so now we've covered our mediums, we've covered the paint, we've covered the brushes, the different type of brushes, loading your brush with oil and loading your brush with paint. I want to talk a little bit about leaves. That seems to be the majority of the question when I'm traveling, is that people struggle with their leaves. There are artists who don't worry about their leaves. It's just a supporting subject. To me, I like to have my leaves look like real leaves. So I'm going to give you 5 steps here on painting your leaves. So step number 1. Usually when I paint leaves, the light values I put on first, which is my chartreuse and moss green. So step number 1, I pull this. I pull this stroke towards a center line like that. This is step 1. Step 2 is I come up here and I make a little dash up. It's just a dash like that. And the only purpose of that is to tell me to lay my brush right there and pull down. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Repeat this 3rd stroke, 5. Now, the last stroke, instead of going up, you're going to go down. So I'm always pulling towards myself because you have more control. That stroke goes down. Now I'm just gonna wipe out the paint, soften my brush stroke. That, to me, this is one of the most important steps, is to soften your paint. And this will knock down and pull off the excess oil. And when you go for a wipe out, you're not going to pull all your color out. Now I can change this leaf into a rose leaf, a grape leaf, a mom or poppy, just by elongating those side strokes. Now, when I go to wipe out, I always drop down a brush size. I laid that in with a 10, so I'm dropping down to an 8, and I'm going to come up and wipe out down the middle. I'm not going from end to end, just directly right in the middle. And now I'm going to lay my brush right on that line and pull down and hit it again. And then on this side, I'm going to put in some vein lines with the corner of my brush. So this side is negative, this side is positive. Now, then you can do this on this fire or you can do it on the next fire. I come back and put in a positive vein lines, one down the middle. So I have long, short, and medium, long, short, and medium. So this side is negative, this side is positive. All right, so that's basically how I do all my leaves. If I want it to be a holly leaf, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit. And make it have pointed edges. Or if I want it to be a grape leaf, I'm going to exaggerate it more and drag it out. And change the direction of my wipeout, which is the most important thing on a grape leaf. Is I'm going to put my vein line down the middle, and then from that vein line, it radiates outward at one point. So then I come in and wipe out the highlights from that. And it also, as it comes down at the beginning, it comes down a little bit like this. So if you get those 6 basic strokes in there, you can make any leaf you need. All right, so now I'm going to show you a little bit about different types of flowers. So let's start out doing a sunflower. On all of my painting over the last few years, I've changed the process of my painting. And so I like to, on first fire, do only the lightest values. And if you can learn to do this, you're going to get a lot more value in your piece, and color changes. And when you wipe back that dark color, you've got that very light color underneath, and it's going to give you a prettier color. So on this sunflower, normally you will want to paint with your lightest value yellow. Well, what I have found is the yellows become very garish very quickly. So what I use is my yellow brown number 1. I don't use mixing yellow because some of them are cannibalistic. So I use yellow brown number 2. And basically what that's doing, it is putting your dark values in first. So I load my brush with yellow brown 2, or sorry, yellow brown 1. And I start from the outside edge, and I'm going to get a lot of paint on this because I want to be able to pull out highlights, because this is going to be my shadow. Only on the yellows do I do this, just because it's very cannibalistic. Not cannibalistic, it's very the bright yellows become very garish. Sorry. All right, so now you can also pull out and to get different strokes here. What I find is when you start repeating, you see how I'm starting to repeat? They're all going the same direction. So just come in and change that. May want a skinny one through here. And I'm not being very careful. I'm not worrying about my strokes. The most important thing to me is getting the paint on your piece. I'm not worried about brush strokes at this point, because I'm going to come back and soften those brush strokes. You also want to change the length of some of these because they're not all the same length. And you might want to stick a small one in there, coming through there to show the different growth. Because I'm going to come back here and clean those edges up. Some of them have very wide petals, some of them have very skinny. Now, what I do on the yellows, I paint, first fire is yellow brown, number 1. And then I'm going to kind of show you more than one fire on this sunflower. And then on the very last fire, I will come back and wash it completely with lemon yellow. I don't use mixing yellow because it can be cannibalistic. And a lot of the other yellows are also. Lemon yellow is a very strong color. It's not cannibalistic, but it will overpower all the colors. So that's why I don't use it on first fire. Now I'm gonna, if I was painting a piece here, I would paint all my flowers before I ever went back and did any wipeouts. The reason is just like your palette, is that oil starts to separate and that pigment goes to the bottom. So when I come back and soften the brush strokes, that oil has already started to separate. And now I'm holding my brush down close to the quill of the brush. This is a personal thing. If you have more control by hanging on the end of it, go ahead and try that. I find that if I want to really get a close stroke here, I'm going to come down close. This is totally a personal. So when I get this to the point where it starts to have kind of a satin look to it, I've pretty much drug all that excess oil out of it. And if you do this, you're going to have less tendencies for that to run also. Now, when I hold this up to the light, you should be able to see that it has a little bit of a sheen to it. It's kind of satin looking. That's when it's ready for to be wiped out for highlights. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and put my center in. On first fire is always the lightest value, and I want to pull back to this yellow brown number 2. So I'm going to put yellow brown 2 here. I'm going to go ahead and put the I use rich brown for my brown. And you see, I'm not worried about brush strokes here. I want to get that paint in there. And now I'm going to overpaint it. Normally I would not do this on first fire, but I want you all to see So I'm going to overpaint it with rich brown. And I don't care if I get into my petals because I'm going to use that. I'm going to leave a highlight there. A little bit of that yellow brown showing through. All right, now I'm going to, again, like I said, I'm going to drop down to a smaller brush. I laid that in with a 10, so I'm going to come back to an 8. The only brushes I use is this long, this is a 1-inch Aquaflow. And I use that for washes, anything I have to paint large. So that's usually the only time I use this is basically on the last fire. Then I use a 10 or a 12 and an 8. And sometimes maybe a 6 if I need it to be just a little smaller. And then I'll use a 4 also, and then a scroller. Those are the only brushes I use, but I have probably 4 or 5 of each one of them because I don't clean my brushes. So every brush has a different color. All right. Now I'm going to pull the highlights out of this. And I'm just going to come in here and separate these brush strokes. Remember, this is your shadows that you're putting in. And on the last fire, that will be the dark part, and your lemon yellow is going to be your light. And that lemon yellow is going to hit right where your highlights are, and that's going to be the brightest value. But it's not going to hurt your shadow. It's going to keep that yellow brown number 1 in there. So I'm just dragging that paint, and notice as I'm doing my wipeouts how this brush turns and twists. That's what I like about the quill brush, is that you can't do that with a ferrule brush because it's too stiff. I just like the way that moves. And when I cut, I'm cutting with the corner of my brush, and I'm cutting where my thumb is because that's has more strength. And then if I want to soften that stroke, I use the other side. This petal I'm going to leave alone because it's going to be in the back. And I soften it. I'm going to drag this one up a little bit. And soften. So first fire is the 2 important things is highlights, most importantly. And when you're putting your highlights in, instead of thinking light, think in terms of where do I want to add more color? So your highlights are where you're going to add color on second fire. So number 1 is highlights. Number 2 is texture. That has to go in on first fire. If you don't get it that first fire, you're never going to get it. Same way, you can get highlights in with white paint or flux. So that's, but you're kind of playing dangerously by not getting it in on first fire. So that's pretty much my petals. This one's in the back. I'm going to leave that. Now I'm going to work on the center. And as I work on the center, I'm thinking, again, on first fire, you always want to remember where your light source is coming from. And I'm going to put a center in that one. Texture it a little bit. You can use a stippler. You can use a wipeout tool. Just get that texture in on first fire, because second fire, you're going to come in and put more color over it. And see, now as I tap this, if this was brown on top of yellow brown 2, when I pull this highlight out, that yellow brown 2 would show very strong. And that's why I like to get that very light value on the first fire. Now, if you're a color person, you may want to come in here and on another fire and add maybe some violet of iron in the center. Just give it a punch. Or you may want to add purple. Yellow and purple go very well together, so you can put some purple in that center. And I would do this after it's been fired. So, but when I put this rich brown in on second fire, let's get that texture in there first. I'm going to drag that paint into those petals. So I'm going to take it and drag it. And by doing this, you'll start to create value in that petal and depth. Then I come back and reestablish. I'm coming back here and maybe load my brush with a little bit of yellow brown 2, drag that into that petal. Normally this is second fire, so you won't have to worry about messing up your petals because they're already there. But you want to get that dark, otherwise it looks like you just have petals stuck to a dark center. All right, let's accentuate that center again. Put some texture back in it. And reestablish these petals. So now I'm just pulling this paint back into this center and making sure that the separations of the petals show up. And reestablish the center, because if I don't do this, I'm going to have to do it on the next fire. So layering your paint wet on wet will give you a color that you're not going to achieve if you fire it in between. So those are the difference in how you want your paints to look. And my suggestion is for you to test your paints and find the ones that you like to work with and how they fire and how hot they fire. All my paints will fire at 15. And that's what you're looking for, is for your paints to mature at the same level. Okay, so that's pretty much the sunflower. Next fire, you're going to come in here, shade a little bit more around the centers, deepen the center, the petals as they come into the center. So very well, we got about 15 minutes here. So I'm going to show you how I paint my roses and working with gold paints. When you're working with all the other paints, you're going to not have as much trouble as you do with the gold paints. The gold paints are going to roll up on you and get very gummy. So the key to painting with gold colored paints, which is your rubies, your purples, and your pinks, you're going to paint a little wetter and you're not going to play in. So when I load my brush with a gold paint, this is my ruby. And there's a lot of rubies out there. You have to test them, find out which ones work best for your style of painting. Just very quickly before I get into that, here's my water-based green that we put on. Now I'm going to go over it with my oil. This is the one nice thing about water-based. You can soften that as long as you don't have a ridge. You can go right over the top of that water-based medium and look at the dark color you get one fire. So if you're wanting to get black or red or anything very intense on first fire, you can use the water-based. Just remember that you have to make it very thin. It has to be with a synthetic brush, no oil, and you're gonna not have to have any ridges in it, because if you have a ridge, it's gonna chip. All right, so the gold base colors again. I am going to use the ruby so that you can see how it works. Remember that my brush has a lot of oil in it. You can see that by looking at it. It should have a shine to it. Now, as I work into this paint, I want to show you a brush that doesn't have a lot of oil in it with a gold color. Here's my mixing pot right here. It's showing. All right. See how scratchy that looks? It's showing every brush stroke. And when I put that paint on there, that's what I'm going to get. It's going to show every brush stroke. So get the oil in the brush. This tile should have a shine to it. If it doesn't have a shine to it, you're not going to get enough paint on there. That shine, do you see that? And this part right here, this tells me what my brush stroke is going to be like when I put it on here. All right, here's my brush stroke. That's the difference in a dry brush and a wet brush. That's the most important thing with gold colors, is you want this to be wet. So I'm going to paint a rose for you so that everybody has trouble with roses except for just a few people. So my method is probably different than everybody else's. You have to find somebody's style that works with the way your brain works. So I start out with 3 strokes at the top. 1, 2, 3. This basically is where I'm pulling that into the throat. I'm going to put the bowl in. Long stroke. Now I'm not trying to paint this all with one loaded brush. After each stroke, I come in and reload my brush. Now I'm going to put this first petal in and drag it right here. It's where it attaches to the stem. The next one, I'm repeating that same stroke. Repeat of that stroke on the other side. Repeat. And then the bottom stroke is you're just going to pull that petal in. Now, at the top, you're going to put kind of a tent over the top of it. All right, most important part, especially with gold colors, soften that paint. By doing this, you're going to knock down all those brush strokes. You're going to blend that colors together. You're going to force that paint to the bottom of the china so that when you come back and pull out your highlights and you're going to get a prettier rose. You're not going to pull out. Now, you noticed I am not playing with this and stroking it and stroking it and stroking it. Every time you hit that gold paint, it's going to leave a brush stroke and it's going to start rolling up on you. All right, let's put in the bowl, put that back in. And as I'm pressing on the corner of my brush with my thumb and lifting. Then I'm going to hand the other side of that bowl. Soften it. Always come back and soften that brush stroke. Put the throat in, put a couple cuts there. Maybe one there. Depending on how tight you want this rose to get. Now, the side petals, see that straight line right there? Let's drag that out so it's not a straight line. The corner of my brush. There's another petal there. I'm just going to pull this out because I don't want that straight line. Now I'm going to bring this one over. And remember, I'm always pulling towards that center. And the bottom petal here. If I want to kind of flip this forward, I'm going to put a highlight right there and make that petal kind of fall back. Soften that brush stroke. Now, what I don't want is that right there, because my eye goes right to that. So I'm just going to pull a petal across there. And if I want to, I'll pull one there. Then at the top, you're just going to drag and pull your petals down. And a couple cuts through there. Then I just maybe want to change the edges. Come in and clean up my edges. All right, so here is what happens when you overwork this paint. There's my gold color. I want to paint, if you're painting with this and you're painting dry instead of wet, this is what I find a lot of people have struggled with. And they keep working that paint. They keep brushing it. And the more you brush it, you're pulling that flux out of it. And it's starting to get gummy and roll up on you. See how that's getting like cat fur? And the more you work it, the worse it's going to get. So what you do is you go back into that paint, put oil back in your brush, back into your paint. Now, you're going to load your brush with the ruby. You're a little wetter. Now you're going to go into fluff. And you see, this is not the flux that I'm going to come in here and make it white like that. I'm just putting a little flux in my gold paint. Now I can come over that. See how that's laid down? And I pulled all that gumminess out of it. So that's what you use your flux for a lot. That's what I use it for. Okay, I think that's probably about it. Does anybody have any questions? Are we still there? Nobody's got any questions?
If you would like to ask some questions, unmute yourself and ask Jane your question.
Well, let me go over this real quick before you all have questions about the color wheel. I showed you my palette was set up with color wheel. You can see, here's my color, here's my palette. No, I got a question. And here's my color wheel. So you set that around. I use this analogous color wheel for everything. So if I'm painting, let's say I'm painting pink today. When on first fire, everything I paint on first fire is going to be in this value. These are your primary colors. Second day, I'm going to be working in all my muted colors. So first day is pure colors. Second day is all muted values because you're going to muddy everything up for shading. Third day, when you put in the background, you're going to use every color that's in here. So your color wheel is going to tell you all the colors you need in your painting. All right, anybody else have a question?
The color wheel, you must have had it for years. This is Brenda.
I have had it. The ones they have now are not as vibrant. These are old, and I probably had this 20 years. So, but you can still get them. It's at artvideostore.com, and I think you might even be able to find them on Amazon.
Okay.
But you can
I'm going to
still
go
get
to
them.
the convention that's going to be over. Okay. I'm going to go to the convention at the Delta Queen in Sacramento tomorrow and
Oh,
Saturday.
good.
So I will make sure I ask about this.
Yes, yes. I use it all the time. I use it
Okay.
for every
That
time
sounds
I paint.
good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jane, we
I
want to
can
thank
see
you.
how yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Jane, I want to thank you so much for doing this presentation. I've learned so much and it's inspired me to paint, and I haven't been able to pick up a paintbrush for about 2 years now. So thank you very much for this
You're
great
welcome.
presentation.
Thank you all.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Travel safe.
Thank you.